We come to week 3 in our series of key Bible readings, and this week we look at the story of Joseph and his family. This is our third and final installment in the book of Genesis. And in the beginning of God's people and his acts for salvation, we learn 3 important aspects of God's character and his relationship with his people: God's plan, God's promise, and this week, God's provision. Week 1, we looked at creation, and we learnt of God, the great architect, who planned creation and spoke it into being. Creation came about according to his plan, and it was good. We also read about humanity's limitations and inability to live according to God's order. We see the separation of humanity from God and his ways, and God begins a plan for restoration. God has a plan. Week 2, we learned of God's promise to Abraham, and through him to his descendants and to the entire world. He promised a people and a land and a blessing. He promised that he would be their God and that they would be his people. And here we have a picture of the promised kingdom of God. God's people in God's place under God's rule and blessing. God has a promise. And here in week 3, we see that the plan and the promises of God are threatened by a dysfunctional family and a severe famine. But ultimately we see that God perseveres with his family and his promise to Abraham. The chaotic and sinful human nature of Abraham's descendants was not enough to thwart the provision of God. The severity of natural circumstances was not enough to stop the provision of God. God's plan and his promises will persevere despite the circumstances that seem catastrophic. God perseveres with his plan and with his promise. We start the story of Joseph with Joseph as a son in Canaan in verse 5 of chapter 37. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. He then had another dream. He told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. The story of Joseph begins here in Genesis 37, where we learn of his relationship with his brothers. I have a great relationship with my brother. We often played sport in the backyard, and I remember one time when we were very young and he was still quite a bit smaller than me, we had a disagreement, and he thought that he would deal with this disagreement by kicking me. And I put out my hand to block him from kicking me, and he kicked my hand. But then he went inside crying, and he screamed to Mum and said, "Mum, Ben hit me in the foot." And no matter how much I would reason, no matter how much I thought my mum would take the logic that I wouldn't bend down and hit my brother in the foot, I was the one that got in trouble and got sent to my room. To me, this was blatant favoritism, but it's nothing compared to what Joseph's brothers went through. Before the story of Joseph we are looking at here today from chapter 37, in Genesis chapter 30 we learn about his family. His father Jacob, also known as Israel, was Abraham's grandson. He had 12 sons who would father the 12 tribes of Israel, and he had one daughter. 12 sons doesn't sound simple to me, but it's far more complicated when there are 4 mothers. Jacob fell in love with Rachel, and he worked for her father for 7 years as a dowry to marry Rachel. But her father gave his other daughter, Leah, to Jacob in marriage. So he worked another 7 years in order to marry Rachel. He had 5 sons by Leah, and he had 2 by her maidservant. He had 2 sons by Rachel and 2 by her maidservant. Because of his love for Rachel, his sons Joseph and Benjamin were highly favoured, and his favour towards Joseph was not kept a secret. Genesis 37 verse 3 tells us, when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. There have been numerous books and many a sermon written about the character and the faithfulness of Joseph. And he does grow into a man of great substance. However, at the start of this story, he seems like a spoilt brat. Not only does he have the favour of his father, but he has two dreams that he interprets as his brothers and his parents bowing down to him. I would have kept these to myself, but Joseph tells his brothers, and their bitterness towards him increased. One day, Jacob sends Joseph out to his brothers who are grazing in the flocks. They took the opportunity to get rid of him, and they planned to kill him. One of the brothers, Reuben, protests, and they leave him in a cistern until some merchants pass by, and they sell off their brother as a slave. They take his robe, splatter it with blood, and give it to their father, implying that he was taken by a wild animal. And Joseph ends up in Egypt. It amazes me how God chooses to use broken families and broken people. God chose to act within the world he created. His plan in the beginning and his promise to Abraham were not going to come about in an external fashion, but within the journey of God with his people. The outcome of the story of Joseph is that the descendants of Abraham would survive a time of terrible famine and continue toward the great promises that God made to Abraham. But God could have intervened in this situation apart from this dysfunctional family. He could have brought rain. He could have blessed the harvests. He could have provided food or moved them to an area unaffected by the famine. But God chooses to use broken people to accomplish his purposes again and again. He chooses to use humans to accomplish his plans and his promise, though he does not need to. But what I believe we can take from Joseph's story is that the journey with God is often just as important as the destination. And our God continues to journey with us in relationship. Sometimes we might see this as we walk in relationship with him. And sometimes, like Joseph, we might look back and see how the Lord was working in hindsight. And sometimes we might miss altogether the Lord's hand working in our lives. What we need to know, though, is that he is constantly at work in our lives and around us. And he invites us to join with him in accomplishing his purposes. What an honour. What is it that God is doing around you that you can join him in? What blessings are you currently walking in? What unfortunate and unfair situation in the past has led to God's blessing and God's purposes being accomplished in your life? Joseph had a dream, but in the end his brothers had the power and managed to get rid of him. Earthly power and dreams may mount to nothing, but God-given dreams and directions come with his provision and preservation. The story of a young Joseph in Canaan poses the question, who has the power to accomplish dreams? God is a God who preserves his plans and his promises and his people. And he preserves the life of Joseph, and he will preserve the plan and the promise that he has revealed to Joseph in his dreams. Yet this is just the beginning of the journey, and it would be many years before his dream would be fulfilled. We come to the second part in the story of Joseph, Joseph as a slave in Egypt, and reading chapter 39 from verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When the master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave success in everything that he did, Joseph found favour in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household and entrusted to his care everything that he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. In Egypt, Joseph was faithful as a servant first to Potiphar and then to the prison warden. Not only was he faithful in his service, but the Lord also gave him success in all that he did. This did not go unnoticed, and Potiphar put Joseph in charge of all that he had. But Potiphar's wife was attracted to Joseph, and after refusing her advances, she made false allegations against him, and Potiphar had Joseph thrown in prison. In prison, once again, the Lord's blessing was apparent in the life of Joseph. So the warden put Joseph in charge of the prison, and it was there he moved from dreamer to interpreter of dreams. Two of Pharaoh's officials had been imprisoned, and both men had dreams the same night that disturbed them. Reading Genesis 40 from verse 5. Each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why do you look sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there is no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." Joseph interprets that in 3 days the cupbearer would be restored to his position and the baker would be executed. And it came to be just as Joseph had interpreted the dreams. But when the cupbearer returned to the king's court, he forgot about Joseph until the Pharaoh himself is troubled by a dream. None of the wise men and magicians in all the land could tell Pharaoh what his dream meant. When the cupbearer remembered that Joseph had interpreted his dream, Joseph is released from prison to interpret the Pharaoh's dream. God has the power in any situation. In this story, Joseph, though blessed and prosperous, though faithful and a man of integrity, he seemed to have no power over the circumstances that he faced. Like with his brothers, again Joseph has no control over his destiny. The circumstances were beyond his control and were just plain unfair. Yet God was in control. God had his purposes in mind, and God has the power to overcome captivity. We learned of God's power and plans and promise in the first 2 weeks of this series. That God planned creation and all he needed to do was speak and it came into being. We learned that God continued to speak things into being as he made great promises of a future kingdom to Abraham. God is transcendent and has power over all creation. And the situations that Joseph is facing are insignificant in light of God's power. The situation of famine that he and his people would face in coming chapters paled in insignificance to the mighty power of God who created the land and the rain and the crops. But in this situation where Joseph seemed to have no control, where he could have given up hope in the dream that God had given him, he continues to journey with God. And as he continued as a man of character through the blessings and the adversity that God led him through, he became wise and mature and ready for God to fulfill the dream that he had given him as a boy. This leads us to the third part of Joseph's story, Joseph, a prince in Egypt. Joseph tells the Pharaoh that his dream is a warning that there will be 7 years of abundance and prosperity in the land. But those 7 good years would be followed by 7 years of famine. Joseph tells the Pharaoh that 1/5 of the food in the land should be reserved for those years of famine. We read this story in Genesis 41, verse 39. The Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." Joseph is wise, diligent, and faithful in his service to the Pharaoh, and he stores large amounts of grain. After 7 years, the famine comes, as Joseph foretold, and Pharaoh puts Joseph in charge of distributing and selling the grain. Meanwhile, the famine was also affecting Canaan, and Jacob sends Joseph's brothers to buy grain for the family. When they arrive in Egypt and come to Joseph to purchase the grain, Joseph recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. He plays games with them, sending one of them to prison and the rest of them back to Canaan. But eventually he reveals to them his identity and he forgives them. Genesis 45, verses 4 to 8. He said, "I am your brother, Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 there will be no ploughing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God." So the family of Israel, numbering about 70, including Joseph and his wife and children, moved into the land given them by the Pharaoh. And through Egypt and through Israel and through the life of Joseph, God preserved a small remnant of Israel and saved Israel from the famine. So the family of Israel, numbering about 70, including Joseph and his wife and children, moved into the land given them by the Pharaoh. And through Egypt and through Joseph, God preserved the small nation of Israel from the imminent threat of famine. God's promise to Abraham and his plan for his people was just holding on. A small family of nomadic farmers who lived off the land had no hope of surviving a 7-year famine. But God has the power to overcome the forces of nature. And he does fulfill the dreams that he has given his people. He will not let his plan amount to nothing. He will not let his promise amount to nothing. He will keep his plan and his promise by preserving his people. Joseph believed in the providence of God. He knew that his journey, with all the ups and downs, was God's plan to save his people and their descendants, and ultimately his promise to Joseph's great-grandfather Abraham. Even to his deathbed, where he tells his family that God will one day take their descendants back to the promised land in Canaan, Joseph believes in God. Is there anyone, Egyptian or Israelite, who can cope with the problem of famine which lies beyond the wisdom of even the great empire Egypt? God would provide the one who would save them. In this case, it was Joseph. And as we read through the Bible in this series, we will come across many people who God uses to save his people, to keep his promise, and to keep his plan on track. And ultimately, he would bring about one man, his son, who would fulfill his plan for relationship with his people, and who would fulfill his promise for a kingdom, that he would be our God and that we would be his people. God perseveres with his promise. The big picture of this story is that a remnant of God's people was saved, that God journeys with his people towards his plans and his promise. And though Joseph is regarded as a man of great character, it is his journey with God that brought about the character, rather than his character leading him on a journey. God perseveres with his people, and God preserves his people. God's care is not just about the big picture, but he cares about the individual. We see this in Joseph, as his life was saved in chapter 37, his integrity safeguarded in chapter 39, his freedom secured in chapters 40 and 41, and his family is reconciled to him in the latter half of this story. Now, if Joseph could tell you one thing, I believe it would be this, that God works for good. After Jacob died and his brothers were worried that Joseph would turn against them, he says to them in chapter 50, verse 19, "But Joseph says to them, 'Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children.' And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them." In light of the story of Joseph, we learn that God has the power to accomplish his plans and his promise through us. That your faithfulness and character is more important than the situation that you're in. That God sees the details of your situation and that He sees the big picture and He is in control of both. He has a plan, He has made a promise, and He will persevere and He will journey with you.